Thank you for joining us. You are a part of an elite group who recognizes that Black women's health should be at the forefront of the national conversation. We are mothers, daughters, activists, entrepreneurs, entertainers, corporate warriors, and more, who help boost the economy and often drive the national conversation. For 38 years, the Black Women's Health Imperative has strived to amplify our voices, help enact policy that protects us, research our issues, create programs that enhance our lives, and produce events like this one to ensure we keep the conversation going about the issues that matter to us most. So, let's get started with our program.
Good afternoon. I'm Leslie Foster, your moderator for this afternoon. And on behalf of the Black Women's Health Imperative and the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, I'd like to welcome you to the second seminar in our series focused on exploring how diverse clinical trial researchers, principal investigators, and healthcare providers can address the disparities in rare disease clinical trials and research space. Participants in clinical trials should represent the patients that will use medical therapies, but often people from racial and ethnic, minority, and other diverse groups are underrepresented in clinical research. And the disparities in clinical trial participation, the inequities and the delays in diagnoses experienced by rare disease patients of color are compounded by significant underrepresentation of minority, racial, and ethnic populations in both medical and clinical research professions. A recent Urban Institute study showed that Black adults were less likely to report being the same race as their healthcare providers than white adults or adults of other races. Also, less than 1 in 4 Hispanic or Latinx adults reported sharing a racial, ethnic, or language background with their usual health provider. This underscores the need for educational resources and programs aimed at improving diversity among healthcare professionals, scientists, and researchers. But there's also a need for a diverse patient population in clinical trials. So today, we're going to talk about moving that needle, rare disease clinical trials ecosystem for patients of color. We're going to talk with subject matter experts and professionals about the importance of a shared identity among patients and providers to improve diversity in research and clinical trials. And through this seminar series, RDDC hopes to realize increased minority participation in positions such as clinical trial investigators and coordinators, which would thereby facilitate minority recruitment in clinical trials and research. Let's get to our panelists because we have a dynamic group today. Angel Akinbuyu is the Director of Site and Patient Diversity for Syneos Health. Dr. Janka Camille Bull is a Strategic Regulatory Consultant, former Assistant Commissioner and Director for the Office of Minority Health at the Food and Drug Administration. Luisa Leal is the founder and CEO of the Akari Foundation. And our last panelist, Dr. Lori Wilson, who is a professor of surgery and chief surgical oncology at Howard University. We are hoping that she'll be able to join us at some point in this conversation. And when she does, and if she does, we will certainly welcome her in. But we'll begin with the panelists we have today. And Dr. Bull, I'd love to start, if we could, with the reason why we are here. And that is that people of color have a harder time accessing rare disease screenings. And I wonder, what in your mind are the barriers, from your perspective to that happening?
Yes, it's multifactorial, Leslie. For one, oftentimes patients aren't aware that clinical trials are available. And oftentimes they may have a constellation of symptoms that may not have been, that the dots have not been connected by their clinician. One of the real challenges with rare diseases, and there's an estimate that there are over 7,000 of them and that they impact as much as 1 in every 10 Americans, is characterizing the disease. And so oftentimes there are symptoms that the clinician may need to engage a specialist in order to better understand the disease state and whether or not it may fit into a syndrome that is characterized as a rare disease. One of the facts that I think is really important to point out about rare diseases and its history in the United States is that about a little bit more than 40 years ago, a law was passed by the US Congress to incentivize development of drugs and biologics and other therapies for treatment of rare diseases. There's a saying about rare diseases that much of this is catalyzed by a motivated mother at her kitchen table. So patient advocacy is extraordinarily important. And so the challenges in terms of participation also require a very high level of motivation and seeking answers, and sometimes pushing the healthcare system to be more responsive. In terms of clinical trial participation, awareness of trials, what we have found is that the reason that we don't see greater participation of minority communities in clinical trials is that they're just not aware, they're not asked. So that's another aspect that really needs to be addressed. And so I welcome the opportunity to expand on some of these points. And certainly commend the Black Women's Health Imperative for their vision in catalyzing broader awareness of rare diseases and diverse participation. Thank you.
Dr. Bull, you talked about the motivated mother at the kitchen table, and we've got her with us because sometimes the motivated mother at the kitchen table creates an organization that helps to do just that, to advocate. And Luisa Leal is that mother. She founded the Akari Foundation. You were an immigrant mother. You had 2 daughters on a medical journey that you couldn't anticipate. And I wonder if you can talk to us about how you had to navigate the U.S. medical system and how it led to the Akari Foundation.
Sure. Thank you. Well, it certainly was really hard to navigate. As an immigrant, I came here when I was 19. No one teach you how to be a mother, right? You have to learn basically. And my oldest daughter born with a birth defect on her right hand, which it was kind of challenging because obviously you're not used to see something different. And for me to learn in the system. And then my youngest daughter, when she born, she's 13 now, and she born with disease on her, I cannot even pronounce it because one disease created 2 other diseases on her right eye. She almost lost her eyesight, and she's been constantly in different type of medications, but dealing with the system, I speak English, and as the year passed, I started learning more English, but I didn't know the medical lingo, so that makes it a lot harder. So I learned English in school. I guess like a lot of people here in the US, they learn Spanish in high school. So you'll know how it's not that good. So and then going to the hospital and learn all this lingo, it makes it harder. So on that time we didn't have Google, so I have to go and find my LaRue's encyclopedia and learn the different words and meanings. So yeah, it was very hard. And then a few years ago, I had a boyfriend. We were together for 5 years, and he has 2 boys with Duchenne. And then the mom of the boys, she is from Venezuela. She didn't speak English, so a lot of obviously the terminology, she didn't know it either, not even in Spanish, So I decided to start translating some of the documents. I learned English within the time, and I started translating a lot of documents. And then I noticed that it was a lack of information out there, not just in Duchenne, but a lot of rare diseases for our Hispanic communities. So I was invited to join other organizations that are already doing this, but I thought that it was going to be more than just to translate in a document. It's more about the culture and the needs of each individual country, because we're all different. Mexico, El Salvador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, we're all different. So no one will understand more our community than ourselves. So that's when the Akari Foundation was born.
Wow. And it sounds like you could have used that foundation as you were navigating the system. And because
Yes.
it wasn't there, it gave birth to an opportunity for you to help others. I wonder, Angel, we're talking about rare diseases and getting people into a space where they are both diagnosed and given treatment options and have access to trials that may help them thrive in their lives. And the question is really, how do you do that? What's the influence of community resource organizations when you are trying to pull together people from all kinds of communities to help inform that process?
So there's really no, one point solution to this. It really is a multifaceted approach, that brings in the sites, really brings in the sponsor who's running the trial, brings in the patients, brings in the community. I think a point Louisa made that was excellent was that, even in looking at the Hispanic population, that's, it varies from country to country. And that's true, honestly, of any race and ethnicity. We can't just look at it and bucket all Black people or African-American people into one bucket, because there's so many layers to what makes a person unique and their makeup. And so I think in terms of that approach, we have to, when we're looking at, at sites, we have to make sure that, we're incorporating sites. I think as an industry, we have a tendency to go to the usual sites that we know are able to run our trials quickly and bring in the patients. But the question is, are they bringing in the patients that are most affected by the diseases? Are they bringing in the right patients? So we need to make sure that we're expanding that. And I believe Dr. Bullitt might have said it earlier, people tend to be comfortable with people who look like them. So it's very important that we, excuse me, it's very important that we are, making sure that we're bringing diverse investigators and diverse site staff. When you show up to the doctor, whether it be for a clinical trial or just a regular visit, you want to see someone who looks like you. That's where you're most comfortable. So really bringing in, those types of, that diversity into the clinical trial to the site. But then it doesn't let the, I guess, non-minority or, or the doctors who are part of this, the majority groups, it doesn't let them off the hook, because in this, case, again, perfect example of what Louisa said, when we're talking about materials, when we're talking about even engaging with the patients who come in, we need to make sure that we have people who speak those languages. You need to know, investigators, doctors need to know who their patient base is, who are they reaching, and making sure that they have people that are able to speak those languages, that materials are translated in those languages, and really from start to finish. Because I look at it from a clinical trial, it's sometimes we have a tendency to to have a Spanish translated brochure, but then once that patient's in the trial, none of the materials are translated. So now what do they do once they're in? So it's really the soup to nuts. And then in terms of, the sponsor or industry standpoint, it's really making sure that we are intentional throughout the trial life cycle, so that we're really bringing diversity and that mindset, that intentionality in from the beginning when we're designing protocols, and even taking a step back to whether or not we should even have a trial around a certain, disease, really bringing in that diversity and walking that through from the protocol design to, bringing in those sites, and then, in recruitment and retention of patients.
What you're talking about, at least what I'm hearing, Angel, is really this emphasis that needs to be on individualized care as you are trying to get people to become part of these trials. And Dr. Bull, you have had a myriad of different experiences in your medical journey here. And how do you talk to your patients about these kinds of trials, and how do you alleviate some of the mistrust and some of the fear and some of the concern to say to somebody that this could be beneficial not just for you, but for people who look like you or have your lived life experience?
Yes, I think you've touched on something, Leslie, that's really important, is the altruism of populations. And there was a survey done a few years back that looked at responses from different groups here in the United States and willingness to participate in clinical trials. And the surprising finding from that study was that African Americans were more inclined to participate than white Americans. Certainly the legacy of Tuskegee is a very critical one. I think there were important lessons that transformed the clinical trial landscape because of Tuskegee. Things like informed consent, things like institutional review boards, that there are multiple layers of oversight for trials now that didn't exist before that. So there's a positive legacy out of that tragedy. I think it still requires a lot of vigilance because trials are executed by human beings, and we sometimes can have our blind spots, metaphorically speaking, in terms of the intention of the research and how it's executed. So the checks and balances are really quite important. I think the questions and concerns of the legacy of some of the tragedies in clinical research, we have to be reminded of those, because I think they help us do a better job in the present context. So it's in terms of reluctance. I had a question posed to me years ago when I first started as director of the Office of Minority Health at FDA. And an African-American physician, he grabbed me, he said, "Jonka, what I want to know is, has this drug been studied in patients like mine?" And, I took that to heart because oftentimes these products have not been studied in patients like the ones that this physician was taking care of. So I think there's a need, and you think about this in the context of everything from an over-the-counter medicine that you may be taking for your allergies to a cutting-edge therapy in cancer. What you want to know is, has this product been studied in people like me? Has this product been studied in people like my mother or my aunt or my grandfather or my dad or my brother or my sister? And that's the kind of assurance that you want to have. Fortunately, there are not a lot of products that are drastically different in their metabolism and how they perform, but there are other factors in terms of comorbidities that help, that knowledge about health disparities helps us to be wiser in terms of how trials are conducted. So you may have differences in terms of a patient who has a background history of diabetes, may be on medicines for hypertension. In that setting, may be on a diuretic. So the levels of drugs that they may be taking on an experimental basis may actually be higher. So you want to balance these factors. We know that in minority communities that unfortunately we have a higher rate of obesity. So when you look at getting the right dose in patients, are we looking across aspects of different BMIs, body mass index, and ensuring that the dosing is being done appropriately for that particular person's body, as well as I mentioned, issues that are attendant to comorbidities that may be more prevalent in some populations than others. So I think what this has really pushed us toward, and I think it's quite exciting, is we're getting more of a real world look in clinical development, because there's been a tendency historically to have as pristine a population as possible, to have inclusion-exclusion criteria in clinical trials that would exclude patients that should appropriately be in the trial. An example, in the early days, and I really commend my colleagues at the US FDA in this regard, when drugs were being studied initially for hepatitis C, there was an interest in excluding patients that had comorbid HIV. Did that make sense? No, because oftentimes these conditions coexist. So I think what we're doing now, and I think this is where diversity is transforming the whole conceptual construct of how we conduct clinical trials, is making them much more realistic in terms of the intended population that will receive the drug if it's commercialized.
And when you talk about that intended population, sometimes there's nothing that moves people like a story, like someone who's had an experience. And Louisa, I wonder why it's important, you think, for families like yours with children, or they may be going through this rare disease on their own, to share their stories. How can doctors and researchers help to build a diverse population using stories like yours?
Well, this is something we have discussed several times with other organizations. I guess, first of all, we have to take care of the language barrier, because that is like obviously if they cannot understand in their native language, they won't be able to basically do anything, right? A lot of times you go to a doctor and they don't have someone who speaks Spanish. So a lot of our people from our community, they always have little kids with them, and they have the little kids translate the parents, So it's just one of those things that how, if it was hard for me as an adult, because I was already 19, 20 years old, imagine a little kid translating a medical lingo. So I think it's important for the doctors to learn more about other communities and learn about our needs. And like I said, it's not just like me as a Mexican, every country is different. And then a lot of people don't know, but once we are in the United States, we change a lot, because we tend to mix, we try to go with everything that is going on in the United States, the customs, the needs and everything. And you still have your culture with you. So it kind of like basically you have two persons in one. So it gets a little harder and tricky because especially on the medical system, we come from a country that we deal a lot with holistic medication and the herbs and what grandma gives you and all this big root and stuff like that, and then you come to this country and everything is more formal. You have to go to 3 or 4 different doctors for one, for help you with one disease, even like something as a simple cold. And so I think it's very important for the doctors to learn more about other cultures, is the diversity. We're part of a lot of different organizations, and they always talk about the misconception that they didn't know. It's about that thing about they think all Hispanic people are Mexicans. And it's like, no, you have to learn each person is different. And for us as an organization, we try to educate our community in rare disease and Duchenne about clinical trials. We do a lot of webinars. Every month we have different webinars, and we bring specialists. They speak fully Spanish. We don't want someone who they're like bilingual, have a few words here and there in English. We want people who fully speak the language, who will be able to communicate with our families and explain them what a clinical trial is. Because usually in our community, they tend to believe that a clinical trial is having your kid be a guinea pig. So we try to educate a lot of families, and we've been getting a lot messages from families interested in joining different clinical trials. So now our work is try to convince these pharmaceuticals or whoever we need to convince to bring those clinical trials to our families. Like Angel was mentioning, is like, okay, they have the original form in Spanish, but what about the other documents? So that's where we come in as an organization. If you said, hey, I have this document, can you help us? Or we have these families, that's where we are the connection there with other organizations or medical doctors. We help hand to hand the families with the organization or whoever needs us.
Yeah, that's an incredible resource. I want to let everyone know who's joining us today that this conversation belongs to you as well. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. And once we wrap up this part of the panel, we will do our best to get to your questions. Angel, I have to ask you, as we talk about moving the needle more, to recognize some of the cultural nuances and the needs of potential populations that you're trying to attract to clinical trials. How do you maintain accountability to make sure and ensure that these trials are diverse? How do we keep this moving so that that's the end goal every time?
So I think it's a couple of things. So one, bringing in that patient voice. Louisa spoke on that. and yeah, I think you asked the question, Leslie, is, what can people do to bring in, to make sure that their voice is heard? And that's key for, for clinical trials, and that clinical trial development is bringing the patient voice in. When we look at, from a cultural diversity aspect, a lot of times we tend to focus on just race and ethnicity, but there are so many layers to a person. Their culture and, other things like, language, where, socioeconomic status, all of these things are layered onto the race and ethnicity, into their race and ethnicity, excuse me. And those things, all come together to really shape their healthcare experience. And Luisa kind of spoke about that. I think even when looking at, people of, the Latin culture, it's very different if you look at someone who was born in the U.S. and then someone who came, immigrated from another country. Their experiences are different. So we can't just look at it just as, just bucketing everyone. And so I think bringing that patient voice in to allow those patients to really share those differences with us, share those differences so that they can help drive every step of the process. And, there's no point in creating a trial or running a trial that doesn't meet the needs of the patients you're trying to serve. So we need to understand what those needs are. We can sit in a room and we can hypothesize, but nothing will inform like hearing from the patient. So I think bringing that patient voice in is key. And then I think also a great step, and Dr. Bull, you'll appreciate this, the FDA draft guidance. That was released in April of 2022. So the FDA has issued draft guidance that basically is moving toward a mandate, I believe, that's requiring us as an industry to really show our intentional approach to making sure that our trials are diverse. So moving beyond being reactive or, thinking about it and, maybe this section is thinking about it, but this section isn't, but really bringing it through and pulling it through like a thread throughout the entire, trial life cycle. So really starting off with who are the patients most affected by a disease? And then, looking at that and looking at the inclusion exclusion criteria to see, okay, if this is the patient population that's most affected by the disease, is the, eligibility criteria that we're building in our trials, is it unnecessarily eliminating certain patients? Again, going back to like that BMI example that Dr. Bull gave, that's a great example of how sometimes, bringing that particular criteria or exclusion criteria into a clinical trial protocol has already wiped out a huge portion of, the minority population. And the question we have to ask is it here for a reason, or is it here because this is what we've been doing? So, again, that plan, that FDA draft guidance, that diversity plan, really, helps us to frame, again, that intentionality through all, through our site selection. Again, like I talked about earlier, making sure that we're going to not just the same sites we've always going to, but going to sites that serve the patient populations we're trying to reach. How are we engaging with the community? What, organizations exist in the community, like the Akari Foundation that, exists that we can partner with to pull through that patient voice and to tap into the communities we're trying to serve. So it's really looking, the plan, a strong plan will really look soup to nuts from beginning to end at how we can bring through diversity. So I really commend the FDA for this draft guidance. I think it's put some teeth to something that, we as an industry have needed for a very long time.
You talk about begin to end, Angel, and I have to ask you, Dr. Bull. So, I'm not someone who's ever been part of a clinical trial, and I certainly don't have the granular information that each of you do. But I wonder, as you're sitting in the room figuring out what the trial is going to be, how do you ensure that you're going to have people who ask questions that the participants can relate to or see themselves reflected in? How do you formulate questions that get to the heart of the matter? How do you look on the backside and go, okay, this is what we want to achieve, but here are all the things we're going to do to make sure that this ecosystem, from patients to researchers to the people who conceive and write this, are all doing that with diversity in mind? And how do you communicate that to people who you want to be part of these trials? How do you say, listen, I've got this many researchers who have this experience. They're going to ask the questions this way. How do you communicate that? That might be helpful for people to know too.
Yeah, I think you touched on something, Leslie, and thank you very much for your question. That the planning has to start very, very early. I was part of a working group under the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. And one of the findings in terms of how do you build a more efficient clinical trial system is that you have to plan early. And so a lot of these questions need to be built in at the front end. And I'd also like to highlight the fact that relationships with communities, you have to be present before you need them. Trust is really important. And you can't show up just because you need to enroll in a trial. The other piece I'd like to build on from Angel's comments is accountability. And what we've seen, and this work goes back decades, to be quite honest with you. It goes back to the original work to get more women in clinical trials because women were excluded because of considerations around reproduction, around trials and ensuring that contraception was built in. And so we've moved from a highly protectionistic system to one that is more inclusive, but you also have to build in accountability. And I think that's what the draft guidance from April of 2022 does. And I will say that was many, many years in the making. And I felt like having a champagne pop the cork moment when that guidance was published. And it's really a tribute to many people over many, many years who have literally toiled in the vineyard to bring that to fruition. This has had significant attention from Congress. There was back in 2012 when, for those who follow issues around regulatory oversight by Congress under the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, there were provisions to look at the extent to which trials submitted for approval were inclusive of diverse populations. And what that study found was that it was a very, very uneven enterprise within applications that were submitted to FDA. That also led to, and I certainly encourage everyone to take a look at an initiative called the Drug Trial Snapshots, which was intended to provide more transparency to the inclusion in clinical trials, both for women as well as for demographic subgroups. That has had some impact, but you can still look at diseases that have a high prevalence, are known to have a high prevalence in minority populations, and find that there is still low inclusion. So this takes us to the guidance document that was issued in draft in April of this year, where the agency takes a much more explicit path to what needs to be done. And this is how you do it. And so I think we're going to continue to see progress in this space. To Luisa's point around the need for cultural sensitivity, because when you think about informed consent, and those can be really complex documents. And we're fortunate because we're in an age now where tools such as using videos, using training, using other methodologies other than putting, a 20-page legal document in front of a patient, potential clinical trial participant, that we've moved toward more plain language and using other means of getting the messaging across. I think the other part that is important, in some communities, it's not an individual's decision. It's one that they need to go home and consult with their family as to whether or not they participate. And so, being mindful of the fact that there are going to be different pathways, different strategies that will need to be deployed in making participation a desirable one. And I would also add that participation is an issue across all demographic groups in the United States. It is certainly much more prominent for communities of color, for diverse populations, but we also have a lack of adequate participation by geriatric patients, and they are the main consumers of drugs. But we have trials that largely skew toward middle-aged adults, but for drugs that will primarily be used in populations over the age of 65 or 75. So that's another aspect that we also need to be mindful of.
That's really interesting. You talked about having linguistically appropriate resources for participants in research trials. And Louisa, you have moved mountains to make that possible in so many ways. How do you quantify for people what that does for the people who do decide to participate in a clinical trial? Do they feel like they've been seen and they've been heard? And is there a pride about participation, knowing that they're fully aware of what they're getting into and how they could be impacting others?
I had a family that reached out to me. This was when barely started the organization 5 years ago. And I was still trying to figure out the direction of the organization because they pull you everywhere, right? And he mentioned that his son was accepted to one of the clinical trials, but when they realized he couldn't sign the document, because he didn't understand the language and the lingo, and they couldn't accept him. And I just couldn't understand why. And they said because of the legalities of all the documents, the what it implies. So for us is, like I said, and it comes again to the same thing. For us, it's very important to keep pushing these webinars and educating our community. And once our I feel like once our community is educated, they will reach out to these doctors or organizations or clinical trial labs, and ask for this, for what they need, um, and because once they they need to learn the clinical trials, and all these hospitals, they need to know that it's not just like Janka was mentioning. We have all these diverse communities than just one, and the benefits of all this, it will be enormous for all the community.
Angel, I wonder, what does equity in rare disease clinical trials look like to you? And how would we know if we were participating in a trial where equity was centered?
So, I think when we look at rare disease trials, we have a tendency to almost in a way put like the diversity piece on the back burner, just because we know we're dealing with a already very small population of people. The numbers are very small. The N is very small. So, a lot of times in those trials, we're just trying to find the patients who have the disease and not focusing on, the cultural, cultural differences, really the diversity of the patient. And so I think, to me, that equity in rare disease clinical trials is, understanding the specifics of, I guess, understanding the rare disease, understanding the space that we're working in. You have to acknowledge, again, those difficulties, those challenges. But I don't think it lets us off the hook from that consideration of diversity. I think that it's just a different approach. Then that essentially your patient numbers are smaller, but the patients are still out there. And so I think it comes with that, taking a step back and educating and informing yourself on who are the patients who are affected. Yes, this is a rare disease, but what does that mean? Of the few people, the small number of people who might have the disease, what are those, racial and ethnic makeups? What does that diversity look like within, that patient landscape, if you will? And then really making sure that we're intentional about, setting up sites where those patients are. So if we're looking at a disease and we, rare or not, but in this case specifically rare, and we know that it does affect patients of the Black, Black background and Black or African American patients, then we need to make sure we're very intentional about selecting sites where those patients live. So we're not going to go to necessarily the Midwest, for those patients. We're going, or even the West Coast, we're going to really primarily target, the Southeast, or maybe even some parts of the Northeast, like in the New Jersey, New York area. So I think it's that intentionality, again, of recognizing, one, the the differences that come with rare disease, and not looking at it as a challenge, but looking at it as an opportunity to reach these. These are the patients who oftentimes in clinical trials or in healthcare in general are really forgotten about because, again, their diseases are more challenging, their diseases are more rare. So how can we take that opportunity to serve these patients? And I think the second question you asked was about, how do we know that we're, that the trial is equitable? So I think one of the things that I think industry is being called to do is that transparency, from a sponsor standpoint, being transparent about the diversity of the clinical trials that you run. And so I think that, as a patient, obviously you don't necessarily have that accessibility to the sponsor that's running the clinical trial, but you do have that access to, to the physician who's running the trial. So I would ask those questions, has this sponsor made a commitment? Are you aware of a commitment to diversity in this clinical trial? Again, with that FDA draft guidance, this is huge in in our industry now. So everyone should be thinking about it. So that, it starts up here with the sponsors, but it should be trickling down to the investigators, and it should trickle down to the patients. So if that's not, being apparent, and I think it also will shine through in materials. And going back to, Louisa, there's some concrete things you can ask for, some metrics, some commitment, I guess you could ask for, but I think it also will show through or shine through in, in what you see in terms of materials, in terms of the resources that are available to you that, would take into consideration those needs of people from different backgrounds.
Dr. Bull, for people who may be listening and may be interested, who's a good candidate for a clinical trial if they have a rare disease?
I think what's really important is if you've been diagnosed with a rare disease, and sadly for many, there's not a clear path of therapeutics, to ask the question, is there a clinical trial that I might benefit from? The intent of clinicaltrials.gov, going back to the AIDS era, was to provide more transparency to trials for patients to access. Unfortunately, I think that database has become probably more useful to industry than it is patient-friendly. But I do suggest, if you have a diagnosis, running, just doing, putting the diagnosis in a search box is a place to start on clinicaltrials.gov. I think it also, because what you want to ensure is that you're optimizing your management. Slowing progression can be important. Oftentimes therapies aren't curative, but they can slow the progression of disease. And so, being as comfortable as possible that you are optimizing your care. And unfortunately, in many settings for rare diseases, and just as a technical point, in the United States, rare disease is defined as being in a population of less than 200,000, is really quite critical. I'd also encourage, and I had an experience, and I just want to give a shout out to the Sickle Cell Association of America, because they were instrumental in impacting policy, because oftentimes there are incentive programs that are by design to provide a higher level of motivation to companies to pursue development of products in areas where the numbers of patients and potentially the return on investment is uncertain, and ensuring that diseases that disparately impact minority populations also benefit from these incentive programs is critical. The example that I would cite, and I think this is why it's important, that advocacy at the individual level, advocacy at the disease advocacy level is very important. There was an interpretation by FDA of the law that was passed that they would implement for pediatric diseases that if the disease did not cause death in childhood, that it wouldn't qualify for the pediatric voucher program. And the Sickle Cell Association raised concerns about it, because you have diseases where most of the damage is done in childhood, even though they may live to be older than the age of 18. So they were instrumental in driving a policy change that was of benefit to their community. And I think, over recent years, there's been a significant growth in development of products for sickle cell anemia. And I think a huge amount of credit is due to that community and its advocacy for better therapies.
Angel, you wanted to jump in a bit too, right? Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Bull. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Point before our hour is up, because it's going quickly, is to also highlight that we have a lot of cutting edge therapies now that are genomically based, and we also need to be sure that that in the area of genomics that there's diverse representation. There was an example some few years back, not very long ago, of a risk stratification being characterizing African Americans as having higher risk, but it was because there were the variants being studied that they had an inadequate number of African Americans in the database. And so you can have a misclassification just because you don't have enough people that are part of that scanning of the genome. So I think participation in activities like All of Us, it's run out of the National Institutes of Health, is really critical. But also being sure that some of the truly cutting edge therapies in gene therapies that our communities are benefiting from these therapies, but also that our genes are part of how they're identifying potential targets and that those have been adequately characterized. So thank you.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely. Angel, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, so just going back really quickly to the question about, how a patient with a rare disease can access clinical trials. Obviously, talking to your physician about it, and then also using the cumbersome clinicaltrials.gov website. But I think another great resource that is often untapped are patient advocacy groups, the PAGs. So, there are patient advocacy groups for pretty much, every disease out there, and they are a great resource they're a great resource for patients. And often if you go to their website, they list clinical trials that, they'll tag clinical trials or advertise clinical trials that would be applicable to the disease that, that they focus on. So I would also recommend starting there, because one, you get that clinical, you can get that clinical trial information that's key, but they also have tremendous resources, in the way of co-pay assistance, different type of financial aid that I think, could be beneficial to so many people that they just don't realize, the great resources that are available to them. So I would really, recommend reaching out or looking on those websites of those patient advocacy groups for the particular disease.
Got it. We've got a couple questions to get to, but before we do that, I just want to ask you really quickly, Louisa, were your children at all a part of any kind of clinical trials?
No, not my two daughters or my stepkids. They don't qualify due to age, and the boys are in Mexico. They're the one who has Duchenne, and they live in Mexico. And we recently connected. Well, actually, it's been like 2 years that we connected with a clinic in Mexico. They do clinical trials in Mexico, and actually the founder of that clinic, his boy, he has a boy with Duchenne. So for him, it's very close to the heart, and he has 2 clinical trials right now that has to do with Duchenne. Unfortunately, his son doesn't qualify because of age and because he's not walking anymore. Same thing with my stepkids; they don't. But what both of you, Yanka and Angel, are mentioning is very important. We have to, maybe that's one of the things that we can do, bring to our communities that clinical, that clinic setting, to do the clinical trials and continue educating our community. It's one of the big. It's very big for our organization, the education on clinical trials for the families, because it's out there. It's just people don't know, and it's hard to find it. It comes again to the clinical.gov website. It's so hard. It's not easy to navigate, especially. And then when you have that language barrier, and even though knowing how to read English is very hard. So we actually partnered with another organization called My Tomorrows, and they simplified that form just for Duchenne. So what we do is, and they have someone who speaks Spanish. So now we have families that come to us, and then we send them to them. If they want to know more about clinical trials, they go directly to them. But other than that, we were doing the research for the families and trying to connect them, all over, because we get, even though we in the United States, we get families from Mexico and Latin America a lot. So we try to help all of them,
Got it. As we wind down over these next 10 minutes, we've got a couple of questions to get to. And Dr. Bull, I'd love to ask you, there's a question about how can we promote and create opportunities for more minority scientists to become part of research and clinical trials? Do you want to take that one?
Happy to. I think, you mentioned ecosystem, and we really won't have diversity in clinical trials if we don't have diverse investigators. And I think a point that Angel made earlier, and it certainly was a lesson that has been part of my learning over the years, is that there are competing imperatives in terms of the need to get things done efficiently, and a tendency to continue to do what you've been doing, which some have defined as a path to insanity if you expect it to drive change. And so it means that in terms of recruiting diverse investigators, there needs to be a commitment on the part of industry. Because you can't get the patients in the trials if you don't go to the communities and the healthcare providers that take care of them. So I think there are dots that have to be connected here. You have the expectations of the regulatory agency and what they expect to see in clinical trials. That cascades into how protocols are designed. That then cascades into, okay, how do we get patients? Because we know on the other side of this is that we need to have a diverse patient base. Where do we find these patients? And so for organizations like Cineos, where Angel works, then they have to look at sites. And when they're qualifying sites, there's a process for that. So one of the questions in qualifying sites is, okay, how many diverse investigators do you have that are part of how we respond to the sponsor, the pharmaceutical company, or the biotech company, in terms of them being able to meet the expectations that the regulators want to see. So I think in terms of participation, depending on the specialty area that the investigator is in, I think it also takes some awareness because none of us can afford to be passive. And so investigators also have to reach out. If you're getting inquiries from pharmaceutical detail folks, let them know that you're interested in being part of their investigator pool. And how do you participate? But I think the question has to be asked and responded to at multiple layers in terms of things being effective. It will not happen if we sit back and expect things to change without actively engaging. So I hope I responded to that question.
You did. Angel, I wonder, does there exist, do you know if there's any kind of open access curriculum that undergraduate instructors could incorporate into community college bioscience education as a way to get more minority students into clinical trials?
So I'm not aware on the community college level. I do know that there are some four-year institutions that have actually started to have a clinical research curriculum. You can actually get a degree in clinical research and, an undergraduate degree. So I think that that's a great opportunity, because I think, like Dr. Bull said, a lot of it is awareness. Even in the medical field, we assume if you're in the medical field, you're aware of all aspects of it, but that's not the case. I recently had a conversation with my mother-in-law, who is a 30-year nurse, and I was talking to her about, you should come off the floor and look at clinical research. And didn't even register to her that this is an option. And so, that's true of our more, seasoned healthcare professionals as well as, the ones that are in school now. And so I think there's opportunity with degrees like that if you want to, do something more in the, not necessarily in the investigator side, but, in the other multiple layers of careers that exist in clinical research. But then I think also it's going to, just like we're saying we need to go to where those patients are, we also need to go to where those, potential physicians are. So looking at, the minority medical schools, like partnering with the HBCU medical schools, to implement programs where clinical trial is something that's discussed as part of the curriculum, so that they know it is an option for them. And I think, one of the great points, Dr. Bull made was, that hesitancy to bring in new investigators because they, might not be able to run the trial as fast or recruit the same. And I think then there's opportunity, even in terms of mentorship, to really kind of pair those newer investigators with our more seasoned, experienced investigators to bring them up. And I think there's also a responsibility for us as an industry to make sure that we're training this new generation of healthcare professionals in clinical research for two reasons. And then I'll pass it back to you, Leslie, but for two reasons. One, to, again, bring in additional investigators. And two, even if that's not your path, to make sure that you are well-versed in speaking about clinical trials. That community healthcare physician is really the gateway to the patient. They're not starting usually with the investigator, they're starting with their community physician. But if the community physician is not comfortable and educated on clinical trials, they're likely not going to speak, to their patients about them. So I think that we need to make sure that our healthcare professionals are versed and understand that there are options out there in clinical trials.
Got it. Last word, Louisa, I will give to you. And we're about to wind down here. As someone who has children who've had rare diseases, who help people navigate that space in ways that are culturally competent and responsive, what's your final word to people who are listening today about diversity in clinical trials?
Education. Education. Everything comes to education and empathy. I have to say empathy too, because there's no empathy. I'm sorry, but a lot of times there's not. I didn't grow up with a lot of racism on my end, but I saw it in our community, even within our same, people, we're same community. And everything, like I said, is about education, about teach them that not because someone born different, they're not as capable as other people. And empathy within the same doctors, a lot of times we get from the families that said, pretty much a lot of the families complain about when they got diagnosed, the way doctors speak to them. Mm-hmm. And the way they just tell them, hey, you have this disease, basically take your kid home and make him feel comfortable and love him because he's gonna die soon, basically. And it's just the lack of empathy, the lack of the education on the same, like Angel was mentioning, the lack of education on the same rare diseases. They don't, you will think because they're in the medical field, they will know, but it's not. So, yeah, and then that's what we do as an organization, trying to educate the community and even the professionals,
Got it. So education, empathy, diversity, and humanity should all walk hand in hand on this journey. Well, Louisa Lael, Dr. Janka Camille Bull, Angel Akinbuyu, thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your time, for sharing your talents, for sharing your heart. I hope that this enlightens all of the people who joined us today and those who may partake in listening to this going forward. So thank you all so much for joining our webinar today. We hope this discussion highlighted for you the importance of a shared identity among patients and providers to improve diversity in research and clinical trials. On behalf of the Black Women's Health Imperative and the Rare Disease Diversity Coalition, we thank you for being part of our seminar series. And by the way, please visit rarediseasediversity.org and sign up to be notified about future events. And please share this webinar with your friends and family who may need it as well. Have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you the next time.